I'm here today to tell you the story of how we adopted AI into stratnav.com. So I want to give you a quick intro to StratNav. I'm not going. It's not going to be a product demo. That's not the intent of this. But you do need to know what we're dealing with here. I'm happy to do product demos for anyone who wants one. Feel free to contact me afterwards. But very quickly, StratNav it's a collaborative end-to-end strategy development and execution platform. Basically, everything you need to develop and execute business strategy in a box, in one place for you. And it is a working platform. It started before what we now know as the world of AI. If you can sort of remember a world pre-AI, it was a late digital era product. And the story we're going to tell today is how we've migrated that product into AI as it's been coming out. I'm going to try and do four different demos of different capabilities within the platform. The demos all depend on OpenAI's willingness to play ball here. And I found they can be quite fickle in a number of ways. And so, in fact, almost the first lesson you might get out of this is we need to think about how much dependency we're creating on a small number of very powerful platforms like OpenAI, because that does create risks and issues. But the platform is very fickle in a couple of ways, as I said. The first one, it's evolving very fast and things keep changing. They're not always brilliantly documented and they're not always brilliantly robust. Sometimes things just change without much announcement and your product stops working. So that's one part of the risk. The second part of the risk is they can be, if I'm being honest, a little bit buggy. Now I found, if I can just stop sharing, I found the screen where you can check OpenAI's service status. And if you look here, there's quite a lot of days where there are problems across the core APIs and ChatGPT service as well. So when you're dependent on a backend like the OpenAI backend and it goes down on you or part of it fails, that obviously is quite a big issue. So that's the first lesson. The second item on my agenda is that StratNav app got into AI before this whole sort of Gen AI evolution through what I would now call old-fashioned machine learning. And so this is training machine learning algorithms on your own data and using it to do things in the app. And when it first came out, of course, our users thought that was really cool, because it could suddenly do things that seemed almost like magic. And as it is now with all of the Gen AI stuff, it perhaps looks slightly less cool because the Gen AI stuff looks so much more cooler. But it does still play an important role in the application, and it's still in the application. We added the Gen AI stuff. We didn't remove the machine learning stuff. And so I guess the lesson I wanted to pull out from that is we shouldn't make the mistake of thinking AI means Gen AI only. There are other forms of AI, and oftentimes they are better than Gen AI. So particularly our machine learning is considerably faster and considerably cheaper. And when I say considerably, I mean orders of magnitude faster and cheaper. And yet, for certain types of jobs, it produces just as good an outcome, if not perhaps even better in some instances. So we shouldn't jump to Gen AI being the answer to everything. We should always bear in mind there are other technologies and other solutions which can add often much more value in the process. But I know everyone wants to talk about Gen AI. So the first introduction of Gen AI into our platform came very shortly after the original ChatGPT was released. And it was implemented as a third-party tool. Our platform had quite a lot of help documentation explaining to people how to use the application, how the different models and frameworks worked, and how they interacted to help you develop your strategy. Now, one of the things that we know about documentation is no one ever bothers to read it. And so that was a real problem that users were struggling to use the platform because they hadn't read the documentation. And so we trained a third-party chatbot on all of our help documentation, and now people could fire up and ask it a question. And I'm going to show you very quickly. It's a third party. It just sits at the bottom here of the screen. And if I click on it, I can ask it things like, where do I find the SWOT analysis? And it has read all of our help documentation, and it'll come back with an answer to that question. And people found that really useful. They were asking, quite a lot of questions, more questions than they were sending to us as support. So people are much more likely to ask a question of the chatbot than they were to come to us and say, can you help us with this? And of course, they're getting an answer immediately, as opposed to if they send us a support request and then they've got to wait for us to respond to it. So from a customer service perspective, it was a huge step forward. But actually, the bigger advantage to us, which we hadn't quite anticipated, is it allows us to see exactly what questions the users are asking and what words they're using to ask it in. Because it's very easy when you're running a product to see it through your own lens. So you produce all of the help and supporting context through your own lens with your level of knowledge. And it's quite hard to know to what extent your users are actually relating to that content. But once you see the questions they ask, and of course it's a chat interface, so they ask a question, they get an answer, and they can ask a follow-up question. Once you can start seeing those conversations unfold, and this particular third-party product gives you some quite good reporting on that, you can see what your users are struggling with, and you can either update your help text or amend and retrain the chatbot, or in fact amend the application itself so that they don't experience that problem. So that was a huge bonus. And if I'm being entirely honest, this third-party tool, really easy to use. I think it took about 20 minutes to set up, which is absolutely phenomenal for the advantage that we got. But of course, what we really want is to get into some proper AI within the application. So I'm going to show you a demo. So we're now looking at StratNav app, the application. So you're in the strategy board, and you can see here a view of how the tool works and all the various tools it incorporates and how it interacts them. I'm going to go into the analysis module, and for the purpose of this demonstration, I'm going to select a pestle analysis just because it's a nice, simple framework that I expect a lot of people will have seen before. And you can see this is a filled out pestle analysis it's nominally for Uber, just because that's an organization that everyone's familiar with. It's not actually their strategy, because I don't know what their actual strategy is, so don't read the content too carefully. But if I click on this button at the bottom now and I say suggest pestle entries, the AI is now going to go away and think. So the first thing to point out here is, obviously, you can go to ChatGPT and you can say, can you suggest some pestle entries for Uber? And it'll come back with an answer. And that requires some prompt engineering. So at the moment, everyone's talking about teaching the world how to do prompt engineering, because the better your prompt is, the better answer you're going to get. I'm not convinced that's really what the world needs. And here, for example, you have, instead of copying and pasting or typing a long prompt, you're pressing a single button. We have already pre-engineered the prompt that's going to the API. And so you get all the benefit of all the time and effort we've spent in pre-engineering that prompt. But the other thing that you'll notice is the answer has come back here, not as plain text, but it's come back. I don't know how far we want to get into the technology, but it's come back as a JSON object, which is the way that computer systems communicate data to each other. So it's sent a JSON object back, and our application can then interpret that JSON object and present the information as part of a user interface. So if you were in ChatGPT and it had come back with an answer, you would then have to cut and paste that answer into wherever you want it to be. Because it's come back and embedded it straight into our UI, I can now edit, I can recategorize these things, and if I want, I can press add or delete, but if I press add, it'll add it straight on to the relevant part on my pestle analysis. So it's live and active content rather than content that you just need to Third point that I would make about this is, although we spent the first 2 years of the Gen AI revolution talking about prompt engineering, people are increasingly talking about context engineering. So to create that prompt, what we first did is we took everything we knew about the strategy for this organization across all of these different models and frameworks, and we injected that into the prompt before we put the engineered question to the AI. And that context means that the answer it's able to come up with is that much more specific. I should have stayed on that screen. We could have actually looked at the answers, and you'll see it's very specific answers within the context of what it knows from all of these other models and frameworks about Uber's strategy. And so the answers you get are much more precise. And I think, again, I think the lesson here is, when we first started off using ChatGPT, we asked it what it already knew, and it could tell us, the causes of World War II and things that were well known. With context engineering, we can give it our own information and ask it questions about that. I mean, frankly, from a strategy perspective, that's much more useful. The other thing to say about context engineering is, since the initial launch, the allowance they've made for the amount of data you can push into the prompt has gone up significantly. I think you can put now 1 million tokens into some of the prompts. And certainly we routinely pump an organization's entire strategy plus other information into the prompt to get much more contextualized answers. And we are routinely now pushing in 150,000 token prompts into this thing to get really specific answers. And if you go back and you think about your own experiences with ChatGPT, you're probably typically putting in sort of maybe 100 tokens at a time. And if you want to put in more, again, it becomes a massive cut and paste exercise, which becomes really onerous. Whereas here, the system is taking care of all of that context engineering for you. So it's taking the prompt engineering and the context engineering for you, so you don't have to worry about any of that. So the context becomes really important in generating answers that are really specific and useful. And one of the things that I particularly find as a consultant, a lot of my context comes from client meetings. And if you're in an organization, it might be internal meetings, but bear with me, as a consultant, they're going to be client meetings. So we have a meeting module in StratNav app. And in fact, the way we've got it set up is it's hooked up to Read AI, which then records all of my client meetings, and it automatically injects the transcript of those client meetings into the application. So if you look, I clicked on the button here and it's now opened up and I can see the transcript of this conversation. Again, this was a public debate we had. It's not actually a transcript of a conversation within Uber, but it's public debate just to demonstrate it. And what it can do then is generate the minutes and extract down below here the strategic insights and the actions from that meeting. But it's generating it having had the full context of the entire strategy of Uber injected into the prompt alongside the transcript. So again, the minutes and the extractions you're getting are super contextualized, if you like. If I were to put the same transcript into a meeting for a different client, I would get a completely different summary because it's going to be so contextualized. And the effect is, it's the equivalent of, if you go to sort of a generic transcriber and just pop it into a ChatGPT, it would be kind of like getting your first-year intern to write the minutes of your strategy meeting. Whereas this is much more like having your chief of staff personally write the minutes and extract and manage all the actions. And of course, the insights and actions that it has done, again, they're not just text, they're injected back into the model. And so that the software can then manage and follow up on those insights and actions for you. So you can see that we start generating and injecting lots of context into the application from outside sources, which continuously and iteratively improves the context that it's working with and allows the AI to generate even more meaningful answers for you. So those were the first two things, if you like, that we did to use generative AI within the product. And we immediately hit upon a snag. And that is, we now found we had two modes of AI within the application. So if you remember, we had the first one, the chatbot, where you could ask it anything about the help documentation and the way the application works. And then we have the AI, which I clicked on this green dot here, which is able to use the context of the strategy from within the application to perform work for us. And the two are completely separate, right? So the chatbot that knows about how to use the application and all the help documentation doesn't know about the strategy. and the one that knows about the strategy doesn't know about the help text. And that evidently became a problem for the users. They got confused between the two, and we could see from the transcripts of the conversations people were having with the chatbot that they were trying to ask it about the strategy that they were building and to get it to do something about the strategy that they were building. And that chatbot was trained to come back and say, I don't know about this. This is how you need to do it in StratNav app, but I can't do it for you because I don't know what your strategy is, which is true and correct. But no matter how many times and how many different times we tried to explain to the users that these were two different things and they had to keep them compartmentalized, they just couldn't. So it became a real issue, and we had to find a solution to that. So we went back to chat and we built our own chatbot. So now if I click over here, I can within the application, so this is now not a third-party product, this is our own chatbot, I can have an ask me anything, and I can ask it a question like, how do I add a goal? And here you'll see it's given you quite concise and correct instructions about how to add a goal in the application. Now, of course, all that's really done is it replaced the third-party chat with an internally built chat. But before I go to the next step, there were quite a lot of interesting lessons in this, which I think people might be quite interested in because it pertains to the way you use normal ChatGPT interface. And I don't think a lot of people know about this stuff. So when you're working with ChatGPT, the normal retail one that probably most of you have used, obviously you can have a conversation. You ask it a question, it gives you an answer. You ask it another question, it gives you another answer. And the second question knows about the first question. So, how do I add a goal? You could say, can you do this? And it'll know that this means add a goal because it's got the context of the conversation. The actual LLM that it's talking to is stateless. So it never changes. It had a training date that ended on a particular date, and it never changes. It can't learn anything new. And so the way they do this is they cheat. And when you ask it the second question, it sends back to the LLM the first question, the first answer, and then the second question as the full conversation so that it knows. And if your conversation gets too long and it says, well, we can't keep sending all of that stuff back, then it rather cleverly tells itself to summarize the first half of the conversation and only send the summary back next time. And what's interesting about that is that's why if you have a long conversation with ChatGPT, it feels like it's starting to forget what you're talking about because it's summarized the first half of the conversation. And of course, the summary, well, it will have made decisions about what to include in the summary, and everything else will have effectively been forgotten. Now, of course, they're working behind the scenes to improve this, and they're building kind of memory stuff, but the memory stuff is still just building up information that it sends back with every single prompt that you do. So when we built this chat interface, not only did we have to build the interface that allows you to ask a question, present an answer, and ask another question, but we had to build the storage mechanism that remembers the whole thing and sends it back to the AI every single time. So that's just a nice, interesting quirk about how these chatbots make it look like they're having a conversation with you, when in fact they're not. They're responding to something that you tell them, and they instantly forget kind of everything unless the interface re-injects it into the conversation. So that's a minor diversion that I thought if people are trying to figure out how to do things with it, it's quite important, because if you're building your own app, you have to build all of that yourself. Obviously, ChatGPT built it in their application, but if you're building your own application, you have to build it yourself. Now, of course, the problem, as I said, is we've now replaced the third-party chatbot with with our internal one, and it's giving free text answers. But what we really want is for it to be able to mingle the two. So let's see if this works. But if I now say to it, I want to add a goal to increase revenue. Terrible strategic goal, but I don't want to think of a real one, so I'm just going to suggest that. Now, so what it's doing is it's sending back to the AI, it's sending back that the user asked, how do I add a goal? And this is the answer it gave it. And then it's saying that the user then said, I want to add a goal to increase revenue. And it's now saying, I'm not just going to give the answer as plain text. I'm going to try and extract where I can specific things in a JSON object so that I can build it back into the UI. And you'll see it's correctly identified that I want a strategic goal, and it's put it there. And if I click add, it'll actually inject it straight into the application again. So we've tried to blend that combination of free chat, but also structured data being exchanged between the user and the system so that the application can process it. So that's something that we've rolled out quite recently. One of the things that we discovered immediately is that one of the things that you could do is you could say, well, I don't know, you tell me what I should do. And so we specifically codified that. And if I start a new chat, I can start a guide me chat, which effectively flips the conversation around and says, I, the user, am no longer in control of this conversation. I'm handing control of this conversation over to the AI, and the AI is now going to act as if it were a consultant. It's going to read your entire strategy as you've built it in this app so far, and it's going to come back to you with what it thinks is the next logical question that a consultant would ask you if you were particularly a client, and ask you that question. And again, let me just see what the question says. What challenge is yours? So I think I'm going to put in here, I think the main challenge, I'm trying to think on the fly what the main challenge would be. Main challenge will be that autonomous vehicles put our entire army of self-employed drivers out of business. Okay, I mean, that's probably a fairly poor response to the question, but let's try it anyway. And it's going to take that and effectively do the same thing. We're having now the conversation backwards, but hopefully it's going to look at that, extract anything that it can in JSON format that it can then use in the application. There it has done that. Provide some sort of contextual commentary on what I've answered, and then follow it up with the next question, which actually, if you read at the bottom here, I mean, it's come up with actually quite an insightful question about what the next thing for Uber to think about would be, if that was what they thought the main barrier would be. So it's come up with, at the top here, some information which can now be added into part of your strategy. I imagine Uber already has this as part of their strategy, but never mind. It's come up with some things that you would add to the strategy if you're developing the strategy for Uber, and it's come up with the next logical question. So the conversation would continue. I would answer that question again. It would again extract the JSON objects and follow up with a follow-on question. So that flips the question around and puts, so you can choose, am I the user in charge of this conversation and directing the AI, or have I reached the end of what I think I know and I want to flip the conversation and say, well, if you were in charge, what would you do? So those were the things I wanted to demo very quickly. So things that we've learned in this process. So one of the things, the challenge of mingling deterministic and non-deterministic programming, if you like. So historically, when you've programmed something, you've written a program and it's deterministic. If you put the same inputs into the system, it will always produce the same output. You know, if you have a function and the function is to add two numbers together, 2 + 2 will always give 4. Doesn't matter how many times you do it. It's deterministic. It's easy to test. It's easy to predict what's going to happen. All of a sudden, when you start talking to a generative AI, that's not true. You just never know what the AI is going to say back. And sometimes it says some things that are quite unexpected and quite troublesome because the app then doesn't know what to do with them. So that's something you have to worry about because it's a non-deterministic programming paradigm. Something that's been really interesting is I was just checking the statistics today. Although we promote the AI capabilities of our application very heavily, both in the app and outside of the app, and although the people who use it think it's absolutely amazing and love it, only 20% of our user base has actually tried it. And that I find really strange. And I know, look, I'm an early adopter. You know, if you put something in front of me, I'm going to press the button and try it straight away, right? That's my mentality. That doesn't appear to be the prevailing mentality out there. And so when we're all obviously here because we're into AI. We wouldn't be here otherwise, right? It would appear that not everyone in the world is like that. The last lesson is, again, just to the earlier comment I made, the pace of change here is staggering. It's really hard to keep up. The tools are changing all the time. They change in unexpected ways. So you're constantly battling to keep up and not have your product break and fall behind as it goes. And that is a real change. Just some thoughts in the future. What will AI look like in the future? Obviously, we spend a lot of time worrying about that because we want to build something that is going to keep up with people's expectations of the future and not feel left behind. So a big question is, to what extent are conversational interfaces going to take over from other forms of user interface? Now, my personal view is what we really, and this is kind of what we're building towards, what people really want is a hybrid interface, because sometimes old-fashioned user interfaces just get the job done and people are familiar with them. Sometimes a chat interface is better. Probably what you want is a hybrid where the user can do it either way. So they can click on the interface to add a goal, or they can just type in the chatbot, I want to add a goal, and it knows how to do that. So I think hybrid interfaces are the way forward. So we seem intent on training people on prompt engineering, and people spend a lot of time saying we've got to train our whole workforce to be prompt engineers. I think that may be the wrong approach. And the analogy I use, I walked into this room and I flicked the light switch and the lights came on, right? I do not want and I do not need to be an electrical engineer. I just want stuff that works. I walk downstairs, I flick the switch on the kettle and the water boils, right? That's how I want the world to work. I don't want to be an electrical engineer. And I think we should be careful about getting so obsessed about what you can do with prompt engineering that we think that's the future. I think that could be a dead end. Certainly it doesn't work now, and I'm not sure it's what we want to work in the future. The last thing I was just going to mention, one of the failures we had, and it's on that. We tried, before we did all this, training a GPT to do all of this. I just don't think you get the control over the user experience you want from a GPT. And it seemed no matter what we built, the thing would quickly lose track of it. It would lose context of what it was trying to do. And what you thought was helping people develop and execute their strategy just went off piste and started doing who knows what else, right? Because we just didn't have enough control of it. And so I think that those things, they're useful as a personal productivity tool and they're fun to play around with. I don't think that's how we're going to scale organizations. And I think it's the wrong route to go. And I hope I've shown you what I think may be something more useful and scalable in an enterprise context.